So I won't spend too much time, but that's the structure of what I'll talk about. And it's quite an exciting time, actually. And compared to last year, there are sort of 5 solid trials that are on the scene, at least 2 of which are in Australia. And you're going to hear about both of those in the 2 speakers after me. But just to fill you in on what a clinical trial is, most trials are more of the phase 1 and phase 2, but what you really want is phase 3 studies. And they're the ones that cost 30, 40, more than that, $1 million to run. And they're the ones that there were a couple of Biogen and GSK, as I'll show you in a few slides, had clinical trials in that area, but they aren't there at the moment. And so the trials that are around are the phase 1 and phase 2. Clinical researchers are often involved in phase 1. And the big difference at the moment is there's more of the smaller companies which investor-driven that are getting now into the area of motor neuron disease and enrolling patient numbers with these sort of numbers. So just pay attention to what phase 2 means, because it's really saying that the drug does work and it's safe, but to truly work out efficacy and effectiveness, you really need a phase 3 studies. A lot of studies these days are writing 2/3, and I don't know if that's the right thing. You're either got to be a 2 or a 3. And phase 1 is getting the dose completely right. And a lot of motor neuron disease trials over time have not done that. They've not spent that effort going through and working out trials. So, that's usually where motor neuron disease trials happen. Now, what about, if you really think about it, the best possible trial would be with one patient, and you'd be able to say, well, does this drug work or does it not? And for all those people who've got genetic mutations, and maybe thinking they're unlucky in the audience, you're probably the people where if I think in 5 years' time, and give this talk in 5 years' time, who is likely to have made a clear breakthrough? It's probably those people who've got a genetic mutation that can be individually targeted. And we're starting to see that. It's not in the media in a big way in diseases such as cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy. But if I had to say, well, where's things going to be in 5 years, that's where I reckon it will be. So phase 3 clinical trials are what you want, and it's not quite what's happening, but there is still a lot of excitement. So phase 3 clinical trials have got to have these things. Good medical practice. You've got to stick to a pretty rigorous protocol if you're involved in a phase 3 trial. You've got people overlooking it. You've got data monitors. You've really got to do a trial properly. Ethics approval's tough. Ethics committees do not approve drugs without a lot of careful idea. They almost make it difficult to run clinical trials in the area of motor neuron disease. So you need independent data management control. We're all inherently biased, so it's absolutely critical that independent people are involved in clinical trials. You've got to have clear inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you've got to randomise patients. When you analyse it, you've got to say, well, this is what I started off saying that I was going to do, and this is what I actually did. And clearly defined what you're going to do plus secondary endpoints. So that's what's needed in clinical trials. And really there's a long list of drugs that have been studied, not necessarily well studied, but there's a long list that have been unsuccessful. And so, as someone mentioned before, riluzole is the only drug that has actually shown some benefit and has stood the test of time. People have done analyses and shown that, on a 12-month survival basis, it clearly makes a difference. So 50 milligrams twice a day, it's the only drug that's approved on the PBS for treatment in motor neuron disease. And clearly there's a lot more to riluzole that I could talk about, because clearly there's a lot of issues that it's not the most effective drug in terms of really stopping the disease. So the 2 studies that 4 sites in Australia involved with, Paul's site was one of the big ones, was with dexpramipexole. We were very excited when this study happened. It was a multi-centre study. It had about 800 patients. and it ran through that sort of protocol. So when patients went in, it was all very clear what patients started, where they ended up, what happened to them, and based on an intention to treat. So whatever you thought you were going to do with that patient at the start is what you did at the end in your analysis. And it just showed no difference in survival. So this is a curve that shows people with the placebo drug and the active drug that showed no benefit in their ALS-R total score. Clearly, it was very disappointing for all of us. And then you looked at a number of other endpoints that didn't show a benefit. So basically, it's a cautionary tale that people who are doing phase 2 studies need to be aware that there's limitations in predicting phase 3 studies. And the other study that was also recently completed, and we had about almost somewhere between 5 and 10 patients in that, was the study of this drug, which was also well funded, and it was extremely disappointing to ring into that teleconference and find that it didn't make any difference. So I'm getting on to more hopeful things in a second, and I'll start with respiratory, because clearly respiratory interventions, as someone said before, can make a big difference, and about 12 months increase in survival for those who tolerate the non-invasive ventilation. And that's been shown in a couple of different studies from the first one, which was now more than 10 years old. So patients who tolerate the non-invasive ventilation, at least a 12-month survival advantage, because that's surviving 200 days for those who aren't on it compared to 600 days for those who do tolerate it. So there are clearly through the Prince Charles Hospital, Royal Brisbane and PA Hospital, we've got a nice network of collaboration and linking with respiratory physicians. So the issues for clinical trials are that it's a variable disease, and I mean, I think you probably see that when you look around at lunchtime, that there are some people whose survival is as short as 6 months, and there are many people whose survival is over 5 years. And it's just a very variable disease, and survival is just not a good marker. In that dexpramipexole study where we thought we were putting patients in there and survival was going to help, most patients survived. So that was good news for them, but made it hard for the trial. So we're already recruiting patients when the disease is already quite advanced. Again, that's a limitation. We don't have good biomarkers of the disease. I'll show you in my next slide. And most studies are not going for very long. So 6 to 12 months is the standard. So survival's a poor marker. Non-invasive ventilation's not doing anything to change the actual disease. The ALS functional rating scale, which is very easy to administer, it's done usually by research coordinators, and it's a 48-point scale. Well, it's the best there is, and there's a composite score combining those, which seems useful. Lung function, again, is not a good marker, because by the time lung function starts slipping, there's already significant involvement, and plus some people can lose respiratory function early and be doing quite well and walking around, and it's just got its limitations. And muscle strength testing, which we've been looking at, also is not a reliable marker across multiple different centres. So some of the other ones that are at a research level are imaging markers and MRI, and those at Royal Brisbane, some people will be involved in our MRI study. Using electrical tests, which are uncomfortable, and people have not been able to show one measure that can be used across a lot of different institutions. Blood biomarkers look quite promising. We've been involved in looking at a thing called neurofilaments, and I know Mary Louise might be here from South Australia. Yes, she's been looking at urine for those same neurofilament markers. And then clearly cognitive markers would be a nice area, and again, it's hard to get a good marker that can be widely used. So a good trial would have these characteristics, trying to recruit earlier, longer, try to have as clear a population, and maybe genetics are going to give that answer, and have endpoints that are really clearly defined as to what you're looking at. So now we're on to the bit that I really wanted to tell you about. So there is a lot of information about clinical trials. You can go on that MND RIA website and look up about Australian clinical trials, and you'll see good information about that you can easily access. The cure for MND is clearly very active. Dr. Ian Davis, I think, is really going to be making a difference here, and he's linking very well with Matthew Kiernan, who's the head of the from the MND RIA, and his side also provides you with some excellent information about some of these recent trials. Last year I would have said that ALS Untangled was a useful source, but I think they're just a little bit behind the 8 ball. Anyone who's met Rick Bedlack with his colourful jackets, it's an entertaining look, but they're really not looking at the most active drugs. So here's the nuts and bolts of what I want to tell you about, because I think this is quite exciting, but there really is 5 potential therapies that are around internationally, and because I haven't got much time, I won't go through them in as much detail as I'd like, but edavarone has both an oral form, which I think in Netherlands has been promoting, and an IV form, which Japan has been promoting. It might be approved in Japan for use. The evidence is still at a very early stage. It's phase 1, and I haven't seen good, solid phase 2 or 3 data. Neurone Brainstorm Therapeutics really got a Guernsey. They were originally from Israel, but they've done a study across 3 sites in the US. Pretty short study, and it's not really clear what their stem cells are. Mesenchymal stem cells, I think, from memory. But their initial results were quite promising, and certainly there's a lot of interest in trying to expand that study into a larger patient group. I think they give the stem cells intrathecally, and they give it by 2 different routes. So copper ATSM, you're going to hear from Peter Crouch about his involvement with that study, and that's certainly active. And similarly, Julian Gold with the Lighthouse study is one of the studies that's very promising in Australia. Masitinib from AB Science is also one that I think people are trying to bring to Australia. So all 5 of these studies are potentially going to be in Australia at some time. On top of that, there are smaller investigator-driven studies. And so a couple of local ones that are from Queensland are what Trent Woodruff, and some of his data was presented by Peter Noakes yesterday with an agent PMX205, and Perry Bartlett's been interested in what's called an FA4 antagonist. So this is the take-home study a little bit. I just put this together, and you can see the names of the people behind it. So these ones are all largely these small investor-driven groups. And I may have some of this detail wrong, and I apologise to anyone, but I've put where I think their phase should lie, whether they've already got Australian ethics approval. I would say that's a yes now that I've been talking to Julian. And which ones are actively recruiting in Australia is the copper and Julian study. And I've put there where the sites are. And these discussions are at a pretty good level between the lead researchers and clinicians in Australia that these studies will happen. So there is a lot of promise in that area. So mainly because I didn't have enough time, I'm going to run over. So I've got a lot of information on those studies if people are interested. Yeah, so I've already been told I've run out of time. So I'd just be warning you that there are other therapies, and if you want to look at the other therapy and see if it stands the test of these 6 points, then that would be a good basis to say whether you're worth pursuing that. Finally, a study that a few people here are now involved with, and we're only just kicked it off. It's for cramps. It's the Flex Pharma study with a oral compound. So it's pretty. Sue, what's the entry criteria? 30 cramps a month. So most people who've got cramps are going to meet that criteria. And so we're openly trying to involve people in that study. Cramps and stiffness and spasticity are the things that are being looked at in that study. So I'd like to thank all those people who've supported us and our research at Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. We're very committed to keeping on going and trying to tackle this disease. And I think it is an exciting time now that there are a number of compounds that are really going to compete and really drive us to try harder to get people involved in clinical trials. We've got two very good research nurses up the back and research fellows who are junior doctors who keep us all on our toes to try and involve people in clinical trials. We've had experience across other neuromuscular diseases, so it's a good opportunity to try and lift our game in motor neuron disease. Thanks very much.